Tom Brokaw, thank you so much for being on your show.
My pleasure.
First question, sir, comes from John Cleveland in Centennial. And it's a question I'm sure you hear a lot of working in the media. I tend to. Do you believe that the current news media provides enough unbiased information for people to make intelligent choices?
You know, I've been hearing that complaint for the 45 years that I've been in this business. It was probably more pointed in 1968 during the Vietnam War and when the country was deeply divided politically and ideologically and culturally at that time. One of the great advantages of the new world in which we're living is that you've got lots of choices. You've got blogs to turn to. You've got C-SPAN. Public broadcasting has expanded considerably. Say nothing of the omnipresence of the cable outlets. So I say to folks, you just have to be more aggressive as a viewer and make some judgments for yourself. You know, this is not a one-way street. There's a real interactive relationship between the viewer, the consumer of news, and those of us who report it. And it's the responsibility of viewers to try to sort that out and see what stands the test of time.
And if they believe, as Sheila Roberts, who wrote in, that there's a sense out there that the networks have taken sides, should television these days endorse candidates the way newspapers do?
No, they shouldn't. And it's uneven, again. It rises and falls depending on what's going on at the time. There's human fallacies within those of us who are in this business as well. We're not robotic. Sometimes bias, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. It depends on whether or not your candidate is being celebrated or being knocked around a little bit in terms of how you see it. What I've always believed, after having been at this for so long, is that the American citizen and the American voter, the American viewer, has a very good radar system. And at the end of this long cycle, torturous in many ways, these people will be able to make up their minds about what best suits them as a candidate. No one gets fooled here.
We have heard 15,000 international and national media members here in town. We have heard that the West now matters. And Jenny writes in, Jenny Roscoe from Littleton, saying, you're from the West. Do you sense that people are now, this national political scene, are speaking to the issues of the West?
More and more. Energy is a big piece of it. This is an energy-centric part of the world. Obviously, Colorado has expanded its drilling capacity greatly in the past few years. But as someone who has spent a lot of his life in the West, I've always seen my role and part as someone who lives in the East as an ambassador from the West. You know, there are big issues out here about population, about water use, about conservation, about our natural resources, about the impact of global climate change on the patterns of life here and the wildlife. So, yes, I think that the West will get a lot of attention, and this time it will get attention because the electoral votes in Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico could determine who's the next president.
You and I were speaking before. This is your 40th year of covering political conventions,
yes.
20th convention. Jennifer Jackson writes in, kind of in your experience, of all the stories you have covered over the years, what's been the one that's impacted your life the most? Has it been a convention?
Well, certainly the conventions of 1968 were very memorable. You know, what happened in Chicago to the Democratic Party coming apart in the streets, the great passions about Vietnam. I wrote about it in a book called Boom because it lingered with me so strongly. I am a member of the luckiest generation. You know, we are the byproducts of the greatest generation, the people who fought the war and got through the Depression, and then gave me and those members of my generation, my wife among them, the opportunities that other generations have not had. We had kind of an open path to do whatever we wanted to do. So I think that probably is a big story in my life. But when the long history of this time is written, my own guess is that the big story will be the collapse of communism around the world, the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the liberation of a lot of countries, and what happens to China, which is still a communist country, but it's one country, two systems, a capitalist system and a communist control. I think that probably are those are the developments of the greatest magnitude in our time.
I'm glad you brought up the greatest generation, because Tom Johnson in Boulder wanted to know, will we ever have another greatest generation? His follow-up question was, what's lacking in our society today to achieve that kind of distinction?
Well, what's lacking are the things that we don't want to have again. The greatest generation became the greatest generation because they met the trials of first the Great Depression and then the greatest war in the history of mankind. and they met them magnificently and made enormous personal sacrifices, and their lives were forever shaped by going through that. And they didn't want succeeding generations to go through that. As I asked the members of the greatest generation about their children or their grandchildren, they say, oh my God, they're so much better educated, they're great, they're doing things that I never could have imagined doing. And then they pause and laugh and say, but I guess I had so little, I wanted them to have too much, and I might have spoiled them a little bit. I think that that's what we have to look at.
Cheryl Brungart writes in, of all the people you've met over your years in journalism, who surprised you the most with a question that you've posed, and why?
Well, you know what, people often ask me that, and they expect me to say Mikhail Gorbachev. I did the first interview with him, or Dr. Martin Luther King, or Ronald Reagan, or Margaret Thatcher, or any number of big-name luminaries that I've encountered over the years. But the people who have made the biggest impression on me are the ordinary people who are doing extraordinary things, not for attention, but because it's the right thing to do. I often tell the story of a young black woman at the height of the civil rights movement in Americus, Georgia. The streets were filled with rednecks, with billy clubs and shotguns, saying any black who marches tonight will be dead by morning. And there was a meeting of the black community in the church at the end of the street, and this beautiful young black woman who couldn't have been more than 20 came out, and I said to her, what are you going to do? She said, I'm going to march. And I said, my God, aren't you terrified? And she said, of course I am. I said, why are you going to march? And she said, I have no other choice. And she marched, and nothing happened, and the South was changed profoundly. We were a deeply racist society. People forget, before the civil rights movement and the vision of Dr. King. And because of the bravery of young women like that and others, hundreds of thousands, uncounted numbers of others like that, we're a much better society today because they liberated us, not just as black people, but as white people. We were liberated from the racist institutions and laws and practices that we had.
Speaking of your experience, then, does that make this, what's going to happen here in Denver this week, the nomination of an African-American as presidential candidate, just that much more significant?
It's a big deal. To have an African-American president with his kind of background, where his father came from Kenya and he lived all over the world effectively, to come from the political obscurity to this exalted position and to inspire as many people as he has is really a remarkable development. But this story is not yet over. Part of the issue for the Obama campaign is that his followers are so besotted by him, so passionate about him, they can't understand why everyone doesn't share their view. Well, a lot of people don't. We still have an election to go through. We have this convention, the Republican convention, and then it's play ball. And then we're into the Super Bowl.
Speaking of what's going to happen from here on in, Susan Upson writes in saying this election won't be the same without Tim Russert. She wanted to know what you think will be the whiteboard issues this election season.
Which will be the
whiteboard issues that he would always write on the whiteboard.
Oh, Tim will write on the whiteboard.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a specific state this time. I don't think it's going to be Florida, or Ohio. I think the West will be a big piece of it. When we began this process more than a year ago, it looked like Iraq would be the defining issue of the campaign. Now it's much more the economy, gas prices, where we're going with energy, and a sense that the country, I think this is on the Republican side as well as the Democratic side, the country needs to get its act together.
Can you speak to this convention without your friend?
It's going to be tough. I keep expecting him to show up. We'd start the day together, we'd end the day together, and we'd talk about everything in between. And the part that I miss the most is he's not around to share the stories with. You can't believe what I saw today, or he'll call me up and say, Broach, you're not gonna believe this. On the other hand, his son is here, Luke, and Luke's going to have a role for us, so the family tradition will continue.
Tom Brokaw, thank you so much for joining us on your show.